Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Danielle Schiestel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a college admission counselor at St. Michael's College in Vermont. I was a Jesuit volunteer in Washington, D.C. from 2016 to 2017.
Hi everyone, my name is Matilda Rudolph or Tilly Rudolph. I also use she, her pronouns. I am currently a campus minister at Christ-Ray Jesuit High School in Baltimore, where I also happen to supervise a JV, shout out to Caroline. And I was also a JV in Baltimore from 2016 to 2017. We're super excited to be here today. As you can see from our title, we're going to just do a little bit of chatting and discussion about what it means to be a white female post-grad volunteer. We're going to specifically sort of talk about our experiences in JVC, but we're hoping that whatever volunteer program you find yourself in, that you're able to sort of apply these conversations to that program.
And I did want to mention that while this is a recording, Tilly and I are both on the chat. So if you have questions throughout this presentation as you're watching it, please pop them in that chat and we are happy to talk with you.
Okay, so to frame our conversation, we're going to start with our experiences in JVC. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about mine. Here's a picture of me. I was an advisor for was a group of sophomores. This was their pinning ceremony, and that was towards the end of the year, my year as a JV. So I was a writing lab teacher and TA at Christ-Ray Jesuit High School, which is where I currently work. And I did that for the first half of the year, and then the second half I moved to being an English teacher for the 10th graders. Their teacher left unexpectedly, and so they asked me to sort of step into that role. And I would like to point out also in that first half of the year and throughout the whole year, there was a lot of as other duties as assigned work, which I'm sure you have already experienced or you will experience at some point throughout the year. That's just sort of the life of a volunteer.
Sure is.
Yeah. And so I lived in the Remington Charles Village border area, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I lived in a neighborhood right below Johns Hopkins University, and it was about a 10-15 minute drive away from my placement, which was down near the water. In terms of my demographics, it was a majority Black and Latinx students. And in contrast, it was majority white administration, faculty, and staff. So most of our students were coming from East and West Baltimore, and they were coming into the downtown area to go to school. And most of our administration, faculty, and staff were either coming from the northern parts of the city or the wider parts of the city, in addition to the counties. And they were also coming in and working at the school as well.
So I was just a MARC train ride away from Tilly in Washington, D.C. I was a counselor and program assistant at the Northwest Center, which is a really tiny nonprofit. It's a pregnancy center and transitional living maternity home in Northwest D.C. I lived in Northeast DC in the Edgewood-Eckington neighborhood. It's kind of equidistant between Howard and Catholic universities. It was a historically Black neighborhood that when I moved there was just starting to go through gentrification, which Tilly will touch on a little bit later. As far as the demographics of my placement, the majority of my clients identified as BIPOC folks. Many were recent immigrants. Many were undocumented. We had a lot of refugees from Ethiopia and Central America. So the majority of people that I was serving day in and day out were people of color. Whereas out of the 4 of us who were full-time staff members for this nonprofit, 3 of us were white. So it was one of the first times that I was the only white person in a space, or those of us who were white in a space were in the minority. And so the same goes for Tilly, and that's really where we are approaching this conversation from, this presentation from, and those ideas of being a white person in a non-white space and kind of the feelings and questions that brought up for us throughout our time in JVC.
Absolutely. And so we're going to get into sort of why we're here in 1 second. But before, I wanted to point out that one of the highlights of my time as a JV would be the Snapchats I would get from Danielle of her beautiful little children and her spending time with them. And I was always so jealous. High school students are great. I love them, but they're not as cute.
Nothing beats snuggling babies all day, though.
No, so jealous. And on that note, Danielle and I sort of became friends through that traditional, historic, typical bond between the Baltimore and the Washington, D.C. house. And so we were lucky enough to sort of become friends at the beginning of the year, and that friendship deepened and grew throughout the year and has been very strong ever since. And so I'm very lucky to still have her as a friend and as someone to sort of reminisce about different JV or JV experiences and years, and go through a lot of the questions and the conversations that we're going to talk about in this presentation.
Absolutely.
So why are we here? We really want to focus on this dynamic of the power and privilege of being white in a non-white space. And so there's 3 main sections we have for you today. When we were JVs, we found ourselves asking this question all of the time. Where are the tools? Why am I feeling guilty for being a white female in a non-white space? Why am I having difficulty sort of knowing what to do or what to say or how to grapple with that personally? Why is this affecting me emotionally in ways I wasn't expecting it to? And we spent a lot of time sort of looking out to other people saying, how am I supposed to do this? Where are the tools? Where are the resources in order for me to sort of reflect on these things and work through these things and be okay with being white in a non-white space? And so that sort of goes into why we want to share these tools with you.
And because we had those questions and those frustrations, we felt that it was important for us to talk about that. And we really want to help equip current volunteers and future volunteers with tools that will help you with your own identity development, that we can start here together so that hopefully you can start this work during your year and really feel equipped to show up into those spaces and know how to do that.
Absolutely. And one of the things Danielle and I have talked about over the years is how much time we spent sort of being frustrated and annoyed that we weren't being handheld through this process of being white in a non-white space during our time as a volunteer. And we were really looking to other people to do the work for us. And so one of the things that we look back on and say is, wow, we really needed to accept responsibility of the work that we need to do in order for us to have moved forward. We could have spent a lot more time reading about things, going to different sort of workshops or talks or whatever it is, instead of sitting and being like, why don't we have these tools? Why are we feeling this way? And so that's what we really want to encourage you today to think about: how, as a white female in your placement and in a non-white space, both in your placement and communities, how can you accept the responsibility that you have of the work that you need to do? So to kind of go into this, we're going to go through a few different definitions, and we will outline our experiences as JVs throughout that time as well. So we are going to start with the definition of racism. And this book is a book I highly recommend. It's called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, and it is written by someone who used to work at a Jesuit institution. So while it's not necessarily using the words like Jesuit phrasing, it has a lot of that sort of thought and background in it, and it's very helpful in terms of reflecting on what you need to do in terms of working on racial justice. And so I wanted to use this definition of racism throughout our conversation, which is really focused in on the second part here, or the second line, which says asserting power over other human beings. This is really important for us to be thinking about through this presentation. Racism is a behavior and it looks like asserting power over other human beings, and it is based on and perpetuated by different stories about certain people that are told and that are accepted.
And if you want to think about this in a little bit more of a simplified manner throughout this presentation, if that works for you, I like to think of racism as power plus privilege. So we wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page of what lens we were approaching these questions, these resources, this work from.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And that goes perfectly into our next section, which is going to be talking about what does it mean to be racist, not racist, and anti-racist, which if you haven't read, again, this book by How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, highly recommend as well. It really helps sort of put a finger on these different ideas that you might be struggling with. We're going to talk about what this might look like, what these thoughts and actions and feelings of being a racist, not racist, or anti-racist might look like generally. Then we're going to talk about what that might look like for you specifically as a volunteer. So first, we'll talk about racist. So the main thing about racism that's really important to remember is this focus on people rather than power or policies. So when we're doing or saying something racist, it's about people. It's not about the power complex. It's rooted in denial, and it's not a fixed identity, which is also important to remember. Just because you say something racist one minute doesn't mean you can't be anti-racist the next minute. Yeah, Danielle?
Yeah, so thinking of this on a continuum, then the next thing that we have is being not racist. So this would signify neutrality. It's passive, so you're not necessarily doing the work. You're really still focusing on people and believing that these problems are rooted in people and not necessarily in power and policy. So maybe not yet acknowledging that racism is systemic. And holding non-racist ideas and beliefs and acting in not racist ways still endorses a racial hierarchy. So ultimately still perpetuates white supremacy culture, which will go into why you cannot be passively anti-racist.
Absolutely. It's very difficult, I think, to understand that just because you claim to be not racist, it's not the same thing as anti-racist. And so what it means to be anti-racist or to engage in anti-racist work is that you're flipping this idea of it's not about people, it's about power and policies and privilege. So problems are located in the power and the policies. They're not located in the people. And so to be anti-racist, it's really important to sort of confront those racial inequities and to recognize that achieving racial equality is anti-racist. So in order to be anti-racist, there has to be active steps towards dismantling and taking apart those power and policies that have been in place for years and years and years. So to sort of help us understand what that might mean to be racist, not racist, or anti-racist as a Jesuit volunteer, specifically a post-grad volunteer, specifically a white female, we just wanted to give some examples of some thoughts that you might have. So the first one is, how can I be racist if I'm volunteering a year of my time to work with BIPOC communities? So here we have a classic example of focusing on people instead of power and policies. So what you're saying here, this is a racist thought by saying, I am working with these people. I'm working with BIPOC communities. So in that alone, you're othering the group of BIPOC communities. And you're also pointing out the fact that it's about the people and it's not about the power and the policies and the privilege. And then going into not racist.
Absolutely. So an example of a not racist thought is, I'm not racist because I live in a neighborhood with the majority of BIPOC neighbors. So again, when I'm having this thought, I'm still thinking about people. I'm not thinking about why the neighborhood is the demographic makeup that it is. I'm not thinking about why the neighborhood that I live in has or does not have certain resources. And I'm saying because I'm immersing myself within a community that might not be white, that I couldn't possibly be racist. But again, I'm not looking yet at the power and the privilege that I hold and the policies that I'm perpetuating.
Absolutely, because when you think about it, there are policies that were put in place, something like redlining, or just in terms of investment in the communities that caused those neighborhoods to look the way that they do. And then last but not least, anti-racist. So, and this is a huge question. This is a very, very big question. I don't want you to think that you should be waking up, well, you should be waking up every morning thinking about this question, but it shouldn't necessarily be something that you're like, oh, and what about this?
Exactly why anti-racist work is lifelong work and why we will never be done. So while we are giving this presentation and we have this knowledge, it's certainly always going to be a lifelong work for me to work towards being actively anti-racist. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Of course, yes. We by no means think we're experts on this. This is more just reaching out to a younger like Danielle or Tilly and saying, here are some things that might help you, that might have helped us when we were in the same position as you. And so this question of how can I use the power and privilege that my whiteness holds to create equity in my placement and community is, again, a giant question, but something that you should be, as a volunteer, waking up and thinking about every day, so that you can actively choose to make anti-racist comments and actions throughout your day. Again, this shouldn't be something that they're not fixed. It's not something that's fixed. It's something that you work towards. It's something that you will make mistakes with. But just because you think something that's racist or not racist does not mean that you are not capable of being anti-racist. Just means that there's some work that needs to be done to get you there. So if you find yourself in those two spaces, don't freak out. You're still cut out for this. You can still do this. It's just a matter of recognizing it and working towards it. So from racism, we wanted to chat a little bit about gentrification and what that looks like in terms of being in a post-grad volunteer program. Typically, in terms of accompanying simple living, you are living in a neighborhood that you might not typically live in. And for most, that looks like a gentrified neighborhood. And so there's definition here from the Urban Displacement Project. We wanted to take a second to give some examples of what that might look like in your neighborhood. So the first one is about real estate, and if you see sort of investors flipping properties for high profits, or landlords looking for higher paying tenants, this is sort of a clue in terms of they're moving, trying to displace people so that they can bring in other people into the neighborhood.
Yeah, so a good example of that from my time in DC was towards the end of my year. I saw a lot of the row houses being gutted, and a few of them that were finished were really turning into high-end homes that certainly had rent a price that we would not have lived in as JVC. JVC would not have been able to pay for that housing, and many of my neighbors would not have been able to pay for that housing. So really flipping the housing market is a big characteristic, like Tilly said. You can think about other changes in the character of the neighborhood. So a good example is community-run businesses being replaced with businesses meeting the needs of a new community. So perhaps that is your neighborhood corner store. Like our neighborhood corner store was right across the street from us. They sold all those things that you might need if you needed eggs, if you needed milk, if you needed to run out and grab some groceries, especially if you're living in a food desert. And say when a neighborhood is going through the process of gentrification, perhaps that community-run store goes out of business and is replaced by a hip coffee shop where people like me love to sit and work. I know I've gone into communities and sat in a coffee shop and left and not been part of that community. So those are just some good examples to get you thinking of what gentrification might look like.
Exactly, and both of these are just examples of increased investment in the neighborhood. This might also look like, I think one very important one to think about is trash collection and recycling. In a lot of neighborhoods where there's not a lot of investment in them, there tends to be a lot of trash on the streets. The trash pickup is not as regular or as maybe thorough as it would be in an area that it has people who are willing to sort of complain about it, do something about it, and has that money and that time and that ability to sort of complain about those things. Might also look like new parks, new transportation, that sort of thing. So I'm going to take a second to just talk a little bit about Baltimore and the gentrification of my neighborhood as a JV. And in order to understand it, I want to explain this concept of the black butterfly and the white L, which is in Baltimore. And as I'm going through this, I want you to think about how, if you haven't done this yet for your city or your neighborhood, how can you sort of look at the past policies, past laws, or whatever has happened in the past that makes your neighborhood look like it is. I think it's very important to understand wherever you are, why it is that way. And so the black butterfly and white L of Baltimore refers to this space where the majority of Black folks are living in this butterfly type area, which is on the typically east and west of Baltimore. And then the white L is this area right here where we can see mostly white folks are living in this area. And to sort of explain this and demonstrate this a little bit more, here's an example of a free bus system that works in Baltimore, which is called the Tram City Circulator. It functions in this white L. We see this here. However, it is not functioning in the areas that are part of the black butterfly. An example of a policy that was created or not created to help with this would be this red line that was rejected by our governor a couple years back, which you can see this metro line went through East and West Baltimore through that white L. It was rejected by him because he did not think that the communities would treat it properly per se, and like the crime would increase in those areas. And so that's an example of an active way of not allowing movement between those neighborhoods. And most of the people in those neighborhoods, they use public transportation to get around. They don't have access to a car. They're already using it. And so this would be something that would allow them to get to work faster or get to their families or whatever it is. So I lived and worked in the white L as a JV. And so this looked a little bit different for me because I think in a lot of cities, the gentrification happens in BIPOC neighborhoods, and then white people are replacing BIPOC neighborhoods. In Baltimore, that certainly happens. In the neighborhood where I was, it was a little bit more of white people moving into other white people's spaces, but the same things that were happening in terms of gentrification. So in my year, I watched a barber shop open up across the street, and we used to be an abandoned building. There was a plant store that opened up, a giant food house that opened up, and a Rite Aid that opened up. And so as I was watching this investment happen, I was realizing that, you know, the people that are in this neighborhood are not the people who have been in this neighborhood for years and years and years and years and years. And people would tell me, oh, you live up there, it used to be like X, Y, and Z, which told me that it had to be gentrified because people are saying, oh, it's not bad anymore to be up there or whatever it is. So again, I encourage you to think about what does the gentrification look like in your neighborhoods? Does it exist? And if so, what informs that gentrification?
So with some of this background knowledge, we wanted to go into exploring more of those feelings of guilt and those questions that you might be having that I know I had during my year in GVC. So really thinking about when I'm coming into these spaces, what am I holding in regards to my white privilege? What power am I coming with? What authority am I coming with? How am I showing up in these spaces? So for me during my year in JVC, this was really important because I was doing a lot of counseling. I was acting as a social worker. I was meeting one-on-one with clients. So I was really coming into this space as an authority figure, as somebody who grew up with a lot of resources and privilege, as somebody with a college education, as somebody who was born and raised a US citizen, and thinking about how what I said might impact my clients in their lives. And again, thinking about things such as, what is my body language saying? Am I listening and not making assumptions that I know what people need? So instead of getting ready for a session with a client and looking at my notes and looking at their intake form and assuming that I know what we're going to talk about and what resources I'm going to give them or connect them with, of taking the time to sit back and say, hey, you tell me what you need, because I am here to hold space for you. I am coming into your life. I'm coming into your home. I'm coming into your space. And I'm here to be a resource. I'm not here to tell people what to do. So I think that was a really important thing for me to think about and learn. And while I did feel guilty being a white person coming into this volunteer year and knowing that a lot of my clients have been with my nonprofit and living in their neighborhoods for long before I came and were going to be there well after I left. And how can I do the least amount of harm? Because we know that as white folks coming into non-white spaces, with the white supremacy culture that our country was built on and that our society operates on, that ultimately we are going to be doing some harm. So how can we do the least amount of harm possible is an important question to be thinking about throughout your year.
I completely agree. Intent versus impact is something that I still think about in my work every day.
So some questions as you're exploring that white guilt and that white fragility as folks who maybe haven't really thought about race before. I know as somebody who identifies as white, it probably wasn't until college and until JVC that I really started to grapple with my white identity and seeing myself as somebody who has race and who shows up in spaces with race that impacts others. So thinking about, why am I here? What are your motivations for engaging in post-grad service? Or maybe if you're somebody who is not yet doing this and you're thinking of applying to and doing a post-grad service year or years, what are your motivations behind doing that? And then how do you both acknowledge your whiteness and also decenter it? So knowing that this story this year, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's not about us. We're doing a year of service, so we're here to serve. And really making sure that you know the needs of the communities that you're in and the spaces that you're in, and again, checking those assumptions. I also wanted to quickly touch on white feminism as somebody who identifies as white, as a liberal, as a feminist. It's a really hard pill to swallow that sometimes we are the most problematic folks out there. So a good example of this is during the year in DVC that Tilly and I did. It was the election year and there was the first Women's March, and we went to it and we organized as JVs, and we were so pumped to be out there and supporting our rights and uplifting women. And something that this particular movement often leaves out are women of color and LGBTQ plus folks. So often BIPOC women and femmes are the most marginalized, and we have to recognize that as white women, there's kind of that continuum of privilege. And yes, while we are experiencing some discrimination and some harm as women in a cis male centric society, ultimately our white privilege really does mean that we are still benefiting from most of the systems that are those systems of oppression that are put in place. So that's something to also grapple with, especially if as a white woman, if you identify as a feminist. How can you really be working towards a feminist agenda that no longer others non-white feminists, but in fact lifts up those voices and puts them first?
I think that that is so important, especially as white female volunteers, because we are the majority of volunteers, just period. But that's just the truth. And so it's very important to recognize that being a white feminist, if that's what you identify as, is that part of your responsibility in that is lifting up women of color and LGBTQ plus women. And I encourage you to sort of take a look at what's happening in your own communities in terms of how you can support BIPOC and LGBTQ plus women in your communities specifically. Absolutely. I think you might be surprised at what you'll find. I think there's a lot of things happening. At least I know in Baltimore there is.
So then the other part of those feelings of guilt as a white woman coming into a non-white space and doing a year of service is we really wanted to quickly touch on and examine the white savior complex. And I think this really does go back to that intent versus impact. And that feeling of, if I don't do it, then who will? That's a question. Sorry, some technical difficulties. But again, just thinking about your motivations for doing your year of service, and thinking about, again, the power, the privilege, the policies that you are perpetuating or that you are working towards changing.
And I'd just like to say again that this idea of, if I don't do it, who will, is people-centered and not policy-centered. And at the end of the day, if you sort of approach JVC or lead JVC as saying, oh, I did what I needed to do. I worked with these communities for a year, blah, 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 blah. Then you are performing ultimately. And this is a very difficult question and thought to be thinking about, but it's really important to consider how do you understand yourself doing JVC? Is it so that you feel good about yourself, or that you think others will look at you and think that you are doing good things? Or is it because you really care about what's happening in these communities and making people's lives equitable? What is it that you care about?
Yeah, I think that idea of performative activism is something that we're getting called out on more and more lately, which is so important, because we're not here to just check a box. I'm not here to say, I did a year of service, I get a pat on the back, I checked my box, now I'm good. And this is something I find myself thinking about all the time, especially as somebody who moved from being in JVC in DC, which is a majority Black city, working with majority folks of color at my job and in my neighborhood, to working for a predominantly white institution, living in a predominantly white state. And what are those things that we can actively be working towards changing? And it's a really good challenge to focus on the power, the privilege, the policy, and not the people.
Exactly. And again, this goes back to, it's lifelong work. It's not just JVC.
Absolutely. So now we wanted to give you a little bit of time to check in with yourselves. We've gone over a lot. We have a little bit more that we're going to go over during our time together. If you're somebody who processes by writing things down, maybe you want to grab a pencil and paper. Maybe you're somebody who types or just sits and listens. Again, we will make these slides available to you So don't feel like you have to be answering these questions right now. We just want to give you some reflection tools for yourself. So first, think about, how am I feeling? Notice your physical and your emotional reactions to the things we've been talking about, thinking of both consolations and desolation. So did something we say make you go, oof, and kind of tense up? Did you really feel something in the pit of your stomach? Where are you holding stress? Where are you holding tension? Our bodies can really tell us about how we're thinking and how we're feeling and how we're processing things. So whenever we are reflecting, whenever we're doing a deep dive into our identity, whenever we're doing a deep dive into our impact, it's really important to not only check in on your emotions and your thoughts, but also physically checking in on your body and your body language. And again, that goes back to, how are we showing up in spaces physically?
Absolutely. The book I was talking about earlier, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, it goes into a lot of considering and thinking about your body's reaction. So if it's something that you find yourself interested in, I'd again recommend that book to help you sort of think about those things. And then the second question we have for you is, when was the first time during JVC or your volunteer program? Or if you're not in JVC or whatever it is, another time for you where you noticed your whiteness and the effect of your whiteness. This could be in terms of your placement, your community, or your neighborhood. I know I definitely had these experiences prior to being in JVC, but I think some of the first times I really realized it was when I was in the classroom by myself, and being the only white person in the classroom with all of my students who were Black or Latinx. And this was, I essentially portrayed by the fact that when I was calling roll, like on the first couple of days of school, I was saying students' names wrong, and they would call me out on that. And I think that that was a fail on my part, because I should have done the work to make sure I knew how to pronounce people's names correctly. And instead I just didn't do that. And so it definitely affected the way that we interacted, and sort of, they're like, you're white, you're very white. And I know, like, I'm very white, like, in general, but I also feel like that sort of, those sorts of moments are where my students were able to hold me accountable and say, you're not doing what you need to be doing. And those moments I still think about, and I can still feel, again, the way I physically felt in that moment, the way I emotionally felt in that moment, and why I still am working on that today.
And I think that's also a perfect example of where you can check in with that idea of your white fragility. So did you become defensive when you were called out about something? Or did you own that and say, you know what, that is my bad, and I should be taking the time to do these things, learn these things, change these things. So exactly like Tilly said, thinking about yourself and how you're showing up in spaces as a white woman is really important. We did add a couple additional reflection resources that we encourage you to use on your own time. So again, you'll get these slides, but these have been exercises that we have both felt were particularly important to our identity development as white allies.
And so the next thing I want to quickly go over, and this is something that you are going to have to do a lot of work on for yourself, this is a very important part of next steps, is this idea of Helms stages of white identity development. So this is from a document that has existed for a while, but went around specifically during June, July. You might have seen it then. And it goes over 6 different levels of a white person's identity in terms of being grappling with their race and the effect of their whiteness. And as you look back on sort of how you were feeling, how you thought about your first experience with whiteness, I want you to sort of apply those thoughts to looking at these different stages of white identity development. So there's 6 different: contact, disintegration, reintegration, pseudo-independence, immersion, and autonomy. This document is going to be linked in the resources, so you'll be able to sort of take a look at one of the scaffolded resources goes through different resources that you can use as a result of whatever step that you're on, which I think is really helpful. So it's very important to sort of just identify where do you find yourself on this list, and what are you going to do about that. So I know that I found myself, especially on the disintegration track when I was in JVC, and definitely part that was just, I understood I was a white woman doing volunteer work, and I didn't know what to do about it. So it was very much stuck in that sort of place during my time.
And I would agree with that for myself. I think that I was kind of flip-flopping back and forth between disintegration and reintegration. And that's another important thing to note, is that you can go back and forward and jump, and this is really a continuum. So these stages, it's not that, oh, you hit one, check, you hit the next, check, you'll never go backwards. You can certainly be floating through all of these all the time, which another great example of why this is lifelong work that you have to actively opt into each and every day.
Yeah.
Like we've said since the beginning, during our JV year, both of us found ourselves asking, why weren't people giving us the tools instead of kind of taking that responsibility on our own to take those deep dives into our identity, find those tools that did exist out there, and do that work on a really deep level. So hopefully this will be a really good tool for you to help figure out what your next steps might be.
And just going on for a few more next steps, again, continuing that reflection and education based on the stages of development. But also we have these ideas of maybe you need an accountability partner. And Danielle, do you want to share a little bit about accountability partners?
Absolutely. So finding somebody that you can check in with, and somebody who can hold you accountable to doing this work. So I was lucky enough that during JVC, I could talk to Tilly about this, and we might not have been in the same community, but we certainly built that relationship where we could be real with one another, and we could talk about these things, and we could ask these questions. So maybe there's somebody in another community, maybe somebody within your own community. Maybe this is something that you do weekly check-ins with before your community night or your spirituality night or your business meeting. But taking the time to find somebody at every stage of your life who can hold you accountable to doing this work, and who can call you out and call you in. And often Tilly and I will share resources of, hey, I read this really good book, you should read it, or have you done this reflection, or this thing is happening at work and I don't feel great about it, or I think I messed up and how am I going to move forward? So just having, again, somebody that you can be really honest with is an important part of doing this work.
Totally agree. It's a gift to have someone like Danielle in my life in order to have those conversations, and you'll find that you will have those people, and there'll be different sort of accountability partners that you'll find for different things that you want to talk about. And again, just really, it's very important to remember that you need to go back to this question every day, as often as you can, which is, how can I use the power and privilege that my whiteness holds to create equity in my placement in going back to the idea to be anti-racist, we need to be looking at power and privilege and not at people. How can I do that every day? And then we sort of wanted to end with this quote about intersectional feminism by Kimberly Crenshaw, which if you haven't read her work or watched her or listened to her, highly recommend.
Her TED Talk is a must watch. If you want a concrete next thing to do, start with her TED Talk.
Yes, 100% agree. And this idea of intersectional feminism, the idea of, like, as white women, we do experience some sort of intersectional feminism, but again, we really need to be taking responsibility of the fact that we don't experience intersectional feminism in the same way that BIPOC or LGBTQ plus women are experiencing. And so it's very important to sort of, as part of your next steps, consider your role in the role of sort of feminism and intersectional feminism as well.
So we have a couple resources for you. Again, we will be sending these slides out if you want them. And we know that people process information in various ways. So hopefully there will be something that works for how you synthesize things and educate yourself. So whether those are books, podcasts, Instagram accounts, websites, these are all tools that we have personally used and found helpful within our exploration of our identities, of our place in this world as white women, and as ways to further actively engage in anti-racist work. So hopefully that these are things that you will be able to take back to your community and use.
That is the idea. We really just hope that we can give you something to work with actively, and really understand that it's not just having this one conversation or thinking about it one time, but really working on it continually. And we want to say, feel free to connect with us. We obviously love to talk about JVC, and we can talk about it for forever. So we have our emails here, and you'll also be able to find us on our profiles on the format
form.
Yeah. And so you feel free to talk to us. As a supervisor to a JV, I find myself talking about this very frequently, and so I love every conversation I have. So I'd love to talk to you more if there's specific questions that you have or comments or.
We would really welcome you to chat with us, and we look forward to doing this work together with you. So please don't be shy. Don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much for attending our workshop. I hope that something may have resonated with you. You might be able to take some of these tools back. Again, this came from a place of the two of us, thinking back to our year as GVs and really kind of grasping at straws and not knowing where to start. So hopefully we've equipped you to do some of the work that we both wish that we had done during our JV year.
And we are leaving you with this picture of us from Rio for our year, and we hope you enjoy our baby selves and our communities. And again, we're just super happy we got to share this time with you. So thank you so much.
Thanks all.